You see ink on skin, a carefully curated wardrobe. But consider shifting your perspective. What if this isn't merely aesthetic choice, but something more profound? It might not be simply about fashion trends or fleeting styles. Instead, imagine it as a symbolic language, perhaps even a potent form of expression. One could venture to say, a kind of biological warfare, not in a literal sense, but metaphorically etched onto skin. Every scar, every tattoo, every meticulously chosen stitch and seam viewed through a certain lens, these could be interpreted as more than just decoration. One might argue they function as symbolic grenades, not of violence, but of disruption, aimed at challenging not just fashion norms, but perhaps established power structures themselves, the very gleaming gates of empire, in a symbolic sense. Your closet, overflowing with garments? Perhaps it's not just a space for storage, but a more resonant symbol, a representation, even of a new kind of battlefield, where identity and image are contested terrains. And G-Dragon? He may be engaging in something far beyond conventional celebrity dressing. He could be seen as actively weaponizing aspects of his very being, his persona, his physicality, his image, not with malice, but as a form of artistic expression, a deliberate and provocative act within a complex cultural landscape. G-Dragon, his ascent wasn't merely a product of talent or chance in the traditional understanding of stardom. He arguably engineered a public persona, meticulously crafting his image not just for entertainment, but as something that resonates on a deeper level, a powerful and multifaceted statement. His very public image, considered holistically, might be interpreted as a living, breathing, and intensely felt manifesto, a symbolic and ongoing act of resistance. This resistance in this interpretation could be directed against several perceived forces, the lingering weight of colonial legacies in Korean society, and also against what some observers critique as the relentless, almost devouring nature of modern capitalist consumption and its impact on individuals and culture. Consider a speculative, and as yet unverified, leak from the year 2026. This hypothetical information suggests a remarkably significant financial interest, potentially in the region of $47 million, purportedly associated with his image, and even the very texture of his skin, though, it must be emphasized, concrete details and verifiable confirmation of such claims remain elusive. The core idea, nonetheless, is that there exists a palpable desire, perhaps within powerful industries, to decode something deeply significant, perhaps even subversive, embedded within his very being, his constructed persona, and his physical self. Think about forensic analysis. In a purely hypothetical, thought experiment scenario, such analysis might suggest that a surprisingly high percentage of his tattoos, perhaps as much as 83%, could be speculatively interpreted not merely as decoration, but as intentionally concealing symbolic scars. These would not necessarily be literal, physical wounds from direct battles, but perhaps more symbolic, representing inherited or deeply ingrained metaphorical trauma, possibly reaching back into the complexities of his family history and the broader historical context that shaped them. These symbolic scars, in this viewpoint, could be understood as the lingering wounds of history, abstractly yet powerfully etched onto his very person, a living testament to the past's enduring presence. And then one is compelled to ask a rhetorical, probing question. Why indeed would a major, globally influential luxury brand, synonymous with high capital and aspirational consumption, be so intensely interested in incorporating emotional resonance, perhaps even the raw, visceral language of pain and vulnerability, into their carefully constructed brand narrative and their marketed products? Perhaps it is because these brands, acutely attuned to shifts in cultural sentiment, deeply understand the potent power of emotional connection in the contemporary market. They may recognize the perceived value of authenticity, even when that authenticity is carefully curated or commodified, and understand the currency of suffering, or at least the representation of suffering, in engaging a modern, often disillusioned, consumer base. And G-Dragon, in this interpretation, appears to be extraordinarily adept at communicating within this complex and often paradoxical symbolic language, a language that blends rebellion and vulnerability, high artifice and raw emotion, within the hyper-commodified space of contemporary culture. Let's delve into a potential interpretation of what could be termed dermatopolitics. We might begin by conceptually viewing the human skin itself not just as a biological boundary, but as a symbolic borderland, a dynamic and contested space where personal and political narratives intersect and clash. Within this framework, tattoo cartography ceases to be merely random ink application or personal adornment. It could be powerfully interpreted as a meticulously mapped form of symbolic rebellion, a deliberate act of inscription upon this intensely personal, yet publicly visible, terrain. Consider the idea of ballistic aesthetics. The trajectory of the ink lines in a tattoo, on his left ankle, for instance, could, through a speculative and perhaps imaginative lens, be linked to significant historical events, perhaps even echoing the path of a distant artillery strike from decades past. This interpretation, while open to debate and subjective reading, could suggest a symbolic representation of a weaponized ancestral legacy, a haunting echo of historical conflict carried on the body. Imagine applying UV light to his skin. In certain interpretations of his artistic output and public persona, hidden Hanja characters are sometimes suggested to emerge, revealed beneath the surface, bearing profound phrases like, "Skin is my last free land." While direct, photographic evidence of this on his actual tattoos might be subject to scrutiny and debate, the symbolic weight of this interpretation remains potent. His body, in this view, becomes the ultimate frontier of personal expression, a final territory symbolically reclaimed, a space explicitly reserved for inscription, for personal, and perhaps even political defiance within a world perceived as increasingly controlled and mediated. Then consider the concept of scar capitalism. Take the burn mark, for example, a personal vulnerability made public. The very act of strategically concealing it for a time, only to then reveal it at a carefully chosen moment, might, according to some observers, have had a noticeable impact on market trends, triggering waves of media attention and fan engagement, and with some analysts even speculating about measurable stock fluctuations of certain luxury brands closely associated with him around such carefully orchestrated events. His vulnerability, in this light, transformed into a point of intense public fascination, analyzed, discussed, and ultimately, perhaps inevitably, commoditized within the relentless engine of the market. This complex interplay could be tentatively termed epidermal warfare, understood not literally, but metaphorically. The tattoo ink itself, in highly speculative and perhaps somewhat fantastical theories, becomes something more than mere pigment. It might be envisioned as weaponized, infused perhaps with hypothetical nanoparticles theoretically capable of reacting to subtle shifts in environmental stimuli, or even, in more extreme interpretations, designed to interact with the very energy of crowds. A similarly speculative and purely hypothetical study, bearing a resemblance to research often conducted at institutions like MIT, might even venture to suggest subtle but measurable correlations between his skin conductivity, a physiological marker, and the lyrical content of his performances, particularly, and perhaps significantly, when he is performing songs with socially conscious, critically engaged, or potentially overtly anti-establishment lyrical themes. In this heavily speculative and interpretative viewpoint, his physical body transcends its biological function, effectively becoming a complex and nuanced transmitter, broadcasting a multi-layered message of rebellion, coded distress, and perhaps even coded hope, symbolically aimed not just at individual fans, but at the very systems and structures of power that are perceived as seeking to define, control, and ultimately commodify individual expression and cultural narratives. Now, shift your focus to catwalk combat. That Balenciaga runway incident in 2013, a moment now etched in the annals of performance and celebrity spectacle. This event might be more complex than simple physical exhaustion or a momentary lapse. It could be interpreted through a critical lens as a biometrically resonant and deeply intentional performance of what we might call trauma fashion, a deliberate staging of vulnerability within the hyper-controlled environment of a high-fashion runway. Trauma fashion unmasked, as a conceptual framework, invites us to look beyond the surface of glamour and spectacle and to consider the underlying currents of emotional and even physical strain that may be deliberately interwoven. Even the seemingly involuntary act of vomiting, in this context, could be reevaluated not just as a sign of physical distress, but as a potent semiotic device, a visceral and deeply unsettling expression that disrupts the carefully constructed facade of perfection and control. Hypothetical, purely speculative analyses of the pH levels of his gastric acid during that performance might even, in a purely imaginative scenario, draw tenuous and symbolic parallels to the chemical irritants, tear gas, for example, often deployed in protest situations, suggesting, in a highly abstract sense, that his very body became a conduit, a sensitive receiver and amplifier for collective emotional responses, for unspoken anxieties and social unrest simmering beneath the surface of mainstream culture. Runway timing itself, considered through a cynical and critical perspective, has been observed by some to suspiciously coincide with periods of heightened market activity surrounding YG Entertainment, his then agency, raising uncomfortable questions about the potential and highly ethically dubious commodification of even deeply personal struggles and vulnerabilities within the entertainment industry's complex ecosystem. His perceived breakdown on that runway, viewed through this lens, might not be simply a personal failing, but instead could be seen as occupying a complex and troubling intersection with larger, impersonal market forces and financial manipulations within the K-pop industrial complex. Consider the idea of haute couture camouflage. Take, for example, the seemingly innocuous jacket linings often found within high-end garments. These might be reimagined as containing coded narratives, hidden messages subtly woven into the very fabric of the design. One could even speculate about symbolic representations of historical testimonies, perhaps echoing the often silenced voices of marginalized communities like comfort women, their stories abstractly, yet powerfully, embedded within the very textile of his performance attire. These would be hidden stories, deliberately and intricately woven into the very fabric of his meticulously constructed public persona and performance practice. Imagine, again speculatively, the data gathered from pupil dilation metrics during high-pressure situations. Hypothetical readings might show statistically significant spikes in pupil dilation in specific contexts, such as direct encounters with powerful corporate executives from global luxury conglomerates like LVMH, leading to diverse and potentially contradictory interpretations, ranging from palpable fear and anxiety in the face of overwhelming power to a conscious and deliberate act of defiance. A subtle but visible rebellion in the face of expectation, or perhaps even a carefully calculated and strategically deployed performance of vulnerability, designed to manipulate perception and control the narrative surrounding his image. The extreme physical demands of his profession and the often reported crash diets and grueling training regimes idols endure for peak performance might be critically examined through the concept of metabolic sabotage. These extreme practices, intended for aesthetic and performative goals, some might argue, mirror historical periods of enforced hardship, even famine and deprivation, experienced by populations during times of conflict or oppression. A dangerously low body mass index, such as the reported BMI of 16.3 in some periods of his career, might not be seen simply as a health concern, but as a deliberately engineered state of controlled emaciation, perhaps even designed to induce temporary synesthesia, a blurring of sensory boundaries, effectively forcing his body into an altered state of perception specifically for high-stakes public appearances, enhancing the perceived otherworldliness and ethereal quality of his stage presence. In this critical perspective, he pushes his body to its absolute extremes, arguably weaponizing even his inherent physical fragility, transforming vulnerability itself into a potent and unsettling component of his overall artistic expression. Fashion, therefore, in this intensely critical and deeply symbolic view, transcends its conventional understanding as mere clothing and aesthetic presentation. Instead, it becomes something far more complex and charged, a form of symbolic combat armor, meticulously crafted and cleverly disguised as the pinnacle of high fashion, a constant negotiation between vulnerability and power, fragility and defiance. Consider the concept of military drag. The uniform, heavily laden with historical and cultural weight in Korean society, is not a neutral garment. It is a profoundly loaded symbol, instantly evoking layers of meaning related to Korean history, colonial occupation under Imperial Japan, the ever-present reality of mandatory military service for Korean men, and the complex, often fraught, relationship between individual identity and national duty. Analyzing his appropriation of military aesthetics through the lens of Oedipal armor allows us to consider it as a form of uniform transgression. Epaulette designs featured in some of his stage costumes, for instance, might be closely examined and interpreted as symbolically replicating the medals awarded to his father for his service in the Vietnam War, but with a crucial and subversive inversion of the symbols themselves, a subtle but potent gesture of defiance subtly encoded within the very details of a garment, suggesting a re-evaluation of inherited narratives of honor and duty. Boot heel heights, seemingly a minor design detail, could even be speculatively linked to the functional mechanics of artillery recoil systems, drawing a surprising and perhaps unsettling parallel between the rhythmic impact of military weaponry and the deliberate cadence of his stage presence. Each carefully measured step on stage, in this interpretation, becomes more than just choreography. It becomes a symbolic reverberation of historical violence, a subtle but persistent echo of the echoes of conflict. Fabric parricide, a provocative term, could be used to describe his seemingly paradoxical reappropriation and recontextualization of traditional military textiles and garments. Kevlar threads, known for their protective function in military gear, might be incorporated into his stylized stage costumes, rendered not as overtly functional armor, but as subtly integrated design elements, theoretically capable of withstanding forces far exceeding the demands of a stage performance. Stylist testimony, in imagined accounts, might even reveal that G-Dragon specifically requested his outfits be designed not simply as armor, but as armor that breathes like a crying child, a striking and emotionally charged phrase suggesting clothing conceived not for literal physical protection, but for a performance of vulnerability, a haunting and paradoxical shield that simultaneously protects and reveals, embodies strength and fragility in equal measure. Expanding on this deeply personal and historically resonant approach, genealogical warfare emerges as another compelling interpretive framework. DNA analysis, in a speculative and perhaps metaphorical sense, might even confirm the presence of a small but significant percentage of his wardrobe, perhaps around 7%, composed of repurposed fabric fibers sourced, incredibly, from his own grandfather's vintage military uniform, further blurring the lines between personal identity, familial history, and public performance. Infrared scans in this purely hypothetical scenario, applied to garments like his signature Chrome Hearts jacket, might reveal hidden embroidery, unseen by the naked eye, yet intensely symbolic in its implied message, perhaps bearing phrases like, "I wear my father's killers as skin." The overarching argument here is not that G-Dragon literally wears history in a factual, verifiable sense, but rather that his carefully constructed fashion choices, deeply intertwined with his personal narrative and stage persona, can be convincingly interpreted as a complex and layered way of actively engaging with Korean history, confronting inherited legacies, and potentially even, in a symbolic and artistic sense, weaponizing his own ancestry, reclaiming it and repurposing it against the very forces that originally shaped and constrained it. Fashion, in this light, ceases to be a realm of mere aesthetic trends and fleeting consumerism, revealing its far more complex and often unsettling reality. It has never been truly innocent, never been politically neutral. G-Dragon, through his artistic practice and public persona, simply refused and continues to refuse to let fashion, or indeed the broader realm of popular culture, remain silent, apolitical, or devoid of deeper meaning. The human body, especially in the hyper-visible and intensely scrutinized world of celebrity and global pop culture, ultimately emerges as the final battlefield, the ultimate site of contestation. It becomes, in this interpretation, the last truly contested land remaining in an increasingly homogeneous and globally connected world, within an overarching empire of aesthetic violence, a constant barrage of images, expectations, and commodified ideals. Luxury corporations, operating at the apex of this system, increasingly understand and actively treat trauma, both individual and collective, not as something to be addressed or alleviated, but as a readily available and highly profitable commodity, to be mined, refined, and repackaged for consumption. The sprawling entertainment industrial complex, of which K-pop is a particularly intense and hyper-efficient example, takes this process further, systematically refining raw human pain and vulnerability, turning it into carefully calibrated profit margins, quantifying emotional resonance and distress in terms of market share and brand engagement. Even the military economy, often operating in the shadows of global power structures, appears to subtly launder its often brutal and ethically ambiguous history through the seemingly innocuous and universally appealing medium of pop spectacle, appropriating symbols of conflict and struggle for purely aesthetic and ultimately commercial purposes. Ultimately, the intended audience, the global consumers of K-pop and fashion, and indeed of broader contemporary culture, will, perhaps inevitably, be forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable and potentially unsettling admission that the seemingly glamorous fashion revolution they are actively participating in and enthusiastically consuming is in fact, when viewed through a critical lens, a form of elaborate and often deeply unethical physical exploitation, masked by layers of artistry. An aspiration. And perhaps even more disturbingly, that every carefully curated and seemingly rebellious gesture, every act of stylized defiance and individualized self-expression, however seemingly powerful and liberating in a moment, may have already been preemptively co-opted, meticulously re-scripted, and seamlessly reabsorbed within the ever-expanding and endlessly adaptable systems of global capital, effectively neutralizing any truly disruptive potential and ultimately serving to reinforce the very structures it ostensibly seeks to challenge. Their beloved idols, the seemingly rebellious icons of self-expression and cultural innovation, may, in this bleakly critical assessment, be revealed as the ultimate consumer sacrifice, unwittingly, or perhaps even knowingly participating in a complex and troubling dance between genuine artistry and industrial-scale exploitation. This, then, is not simply the story of a K-pop icon navigating the complexities of fame and fortune. Is not merely the narrative of a talented designer experimenting with the boundaries of fashion and self-presentation. Instead, it becomes something far more unsettling and profound, a glimpse into the heart of a war machine operating not on physical battlefields, but within the very fabric of human skin, within the vulnerable terrain of individual identity and collective cultural anxieties. This is a war machine, disturbingly, embodied in human skin.